The clock on the wall of the White House Situation Room ticked toward midnight, but for the men and women gathered around the glowing monitors, time had already slowed to a crawl. They were watching a live feed from a Reaper drone, a grainy infrared window into a world thousands of miles away. Below that unblinking eye, a convoy moved through the darkness on the outskirts of Baghdad. This was not a routine patrol. It was the culmination of months of escalating shadow warfare, a series of provocations that had finally pushed the world's lone superpower to the brink of an unthinkable decision. For decades, the United States and Iran had played a lethal game of cat and mouse, a conflict defined by proxies, deniable sabotage, and coded threats. But on this night, the rules of the game were about to be shredded. The order had come directly from the Resolute desk. The mission was surgical, but its implications were seismic. As the Hellfire missile separated from the drone's wings, they carried with them the weight of a new American doctrine. The target was not just a military asset, it was a symbol of Iran's regional reach, a man who had orchestrated the axis of resistance for 20 years. When the missile struck, the explosion did more than incinerate the convoy. It ignited a firestorm that threatened to consume the entire Middle East. In that instant, a red line that had held since the 1979 revolution was crossed. The shadow war was over. The direct war had begun. By dawn, the world awoke up to a different reality. On social media, the phrase World War III began to trend with a terrifying velocity. Global oil markets convulsed as traders anticipated a closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the world's economic jugular vein. In Tehran, the black flags of mourning were raised, but they were quickly joined by the red flags of vengeance. The supreme leader's response was not a question of if, but how. The strike had stripped away the diplomatic veneer that usually keeps great powers from sliding into total conflict. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated friction. To the analysts in Washington, the move was a necessary restoration of deterrence. To the hardliners in Iran, it was an act of war that demanded a response of equal or greater magnitude. This was the midnight strike, the moment the status quo collapsed. It wasn't just about a single drone or a single target. It was about the realization that the guardrails had failed. For years, both sides had assumed the other would blink, that neither truly wanted a conflagration that would draw in the nuclear powers of the East and the West. But as the smoke cleared over the Baghdad airport, that assumption looked increasingly naive. The strike represented a fundamental shift in the American appetite for risk. It signaled that the era of strategic patience had been replaced by a policy of maximum pressure, backed by lethal force. But in the corridors of power in Moscow and Beijing, the strike was viewed through a different lens, as a sign of American unpredictability that required a countermove. As the sun rose on the first day of this new era, the question wasn't just about what Iran would do next. The question was whether the world had just witnessed the first shot of a global conflict that no one knew how to stop. The red line had been drawn in fire, and there was no going back to the shadows. History has a haunting way of repeating its most tragic rhythms, often in places that seem worlds apart. To understand the true danger of a strike in the modern Middle East, we must look back to a sun-drenched afternoon in Sarajevo in June 1914. At the time, the world was enjoying a golden age of globalization and relative peace. Nobody believed that a single act of violence in a dusty corner of the Balkans could set the entire globe on fire. When a young nationalist stepped out of a crowd and fired 2 shots at Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, the world didn't collapse instantly. Instead, it unraveled in slow motion through a series of invisible tripwires known as the alliance system. This is the ghost that haunts the corridors of power today, the terrifying realization that we are once again living in an era of the alliance trap. In 1914, the great powers were bound by secret treaties and mutual defense pacts. Austria-Hungary felt forced to punish Serbia to maintain its honor. Russia felt forced to protect Serbia to maintain its influence. Germany was tied to Austria, and France was tied to Russia. Like a row of falling dominoes, the decisions of a few men in distant capitals dragged millions of people into a war they didn't want and didn't understand. Today, the map of the Middle East is covered in similar tripwires. The United States is bound by ironclad commitments to Israel and strategic partnerships with the Gulf states. Iran has spent decades weaving its own web, the so-called axis of resistance, linking militias in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen into a single coordinated nervous system. When a direct strike occurs between Washington and Tehran, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It vibrates through every one of these connections. The 1914 parallel warns us that in a world of rigid alliances, the golden hour of diplomacy is often lost to the mechanics of mobilization. Back then, once the trains started moving and the armies began to gather, the political leaders found themselves prisoners of their own military timetables. They feared that if they stopped to talk, their enemies would gain a decisive advantage. In the modern context, this speed has been amplified 1,000 times by cyber warfare and hypersonic missiles. If a regional conflict escalates, the pressure on world powers like Russia and China to intervene becomes immense. Russia, already locked in a confrontation with the West in Ukraine, sees Iran as a vital partner. China, dependent on the stable flow of energy from the Persian Gulf, cannot afford to sit idly by if its primary suppliers are engulfed in flames. We are living in a moment where a single localized explosion can trigger a global chain reaction. The Archduke's ghost reminds us that world wars do not usually start because people want them. They start because leaders lose control of the escalation ladder. They find themselves in a position where the cost of backing down is perceived to be higher than the cost of a catastrophic war. As we look at the tension following the strikes on Iranian interests, we see the same ingredients that existed on the eve of the Great War. A volatile region, a breakdown in communication between superpowers, and a series of mutual defense pacts that turn every local skirmish into a potential global conflagration. The lesson of 1914 is that peace is far more fragile than we care to admit, and the distance between a single strike and a world at war is often only a few short, prideful steps. For decades, the map of the Middle East has been defined by a war that officially never existed. This is the Shadow War, a complex and lethal game of chess where the primary players, the United States and Iran, have avoided direct confrontation by using the blood and soil of other nations as their board. To understand why a single strike on Iranian interests feels like dropping a match into a warehouse of dynamite, one must look at the invisible architecture Tehran has spent 40 years constructing. This is the axis of resistance, a network of proxies that has turned the region into an interconnected powder keg, where a fuse lit in Baghdad can trigger an explosion in Beirut or a catastrophe in the Red Sea. The story of the Shadow War began in the wreckage of the 1979 revolution. Realizing they could never match the conventional military might of the West, Iran's leaders turned to asymmetric warfare. They exported their ideology to a disparate group of militias, providing them with the three things required to change history: money,
missiles, and a common enemy. In Lebanon, Hezbollah became the blueprint, a state within a state with an arsenal that rivals most European militaries. In Yemen, the Houthis transformed from a local insurgency into a regional threat capable of threatening the world's shipping lanes. In Iraq and Syria, dozens of smaller groups have become the forward-deployed soldiers of a war that Washington struggled to define, let alone win. These proxies are not merely puppets, they are the pressure valves of the Middle East. When the United States applies maximum economic pressure on Tehran, the valves open. Rockets fall on bases in Iraq, drones strike oil refineries in Saudi Arabia, and shipping containers are seized in the Strait of Hormuz. For years, this system allowed both sides to maintain a fragile, if bloody, stability. The United States could strike a militia warehouse without starting a war with Iran, and Iran could harass American interests without facing a direct invasion. But the shadow war relies on a silent agreement that neither side will cross the ultimate line. By moving the conflict from the shadows into the light of direct military strikes, that agreement has vanished. The danger of the powder keg is that it is no longer controlled by a single hand. We are now in a reality where a local commander in the Houthi movement or a militia leader in Iraq can take an action that forces the hand of the superpowers. If a proxy group kills a significant number of American service members, the political pressure on a U.S. president to strike Iran directly becomes irresistible. If the U.S. destroys the leadership of a proxy group, Iran's regional credibility is at stake, forcing them to escalate to maintain their grip on the axis. It is a cycle of retaliatory math where the final sum is always a global conflict. As we unveil the shadow war, we see that the Middle East has been prepared for this moment for a generation. The tunnels under Gaza, the missile silos in the Bekaa Valley, and the drone launch pads in the Yemeni desert are all part of a singular machine designed for one purpose: to ensure that any war with Iran is a war that involves the entire world. The powder keg is no longer just a metaphor, it is a physical reality stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. The shadow war was designed to prevent a global war by keeping the fighting local and deniable. But now that the veil has been lifted, we are discovering that the shadows were the only thing keeping the global fire at bay.
In the cold, high-stakes corridors of the 21st century, a new and formidable alignment is taking shape, one that threatens to tilt the very axis of global power. While the eyes of the world are fixed on the smoke rising from the Middle East, a deeper, more structural shift is occurring in the north and the east. This is the story of the dragon and the bear, China and Russia, and their deepening embrace of Iran. It is a partnership born not necessarily of shared values, but of a shared ambition to dismantle the American-led world order. To understand the risk of a third world war, one must realize that Iran is no longer a solitary rogue state. It has become the Western anchor of a new tri-continental alliance that links the steppes of Eurasia to the waters of the Persian Gulf. For decades, Russia and China viewed Iran with a degree of cautious distance, often cooperating with international sanctions to prevent a nuclear escalation. But the world changed. Following the invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent isolation of Moscow, the bear found itself in need of a reliable, battle-hardened partner. In the wreckage of the Shadow War, Russia discovered that Iranian drone technology and missile expertise were the perfect tools for its own war of attrition in Europe. This was a watershed moment. For the first time, the flow of military technology wasn't just coming from a superpower to a client, it was flowing back. Russia's survival in Ukraine became inextricably linked to Iran's industrial capacity. This created a new reality. Any existential threat to the Iranian regime is now viewed in Moscow as an existential threat to Russia's own war effort. To the east, the dragon watches with a more calculated intensity. China's rise has been fueled by an insatiable hunger for energy, and Iran sits atop some of the largest oil and gas reserves on the planet. But China's interest goes beyond simple fuel. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing views Iran as the ultimate strategic bridge, a gateway that connects the markets of Asia to the heart of Europe, bypassing the sea lanes controlled by the United States Navy. When the U.S. strikes Iranian interests, it isn't just hitting a regional adversary, it is striking at China's energy security and its vision for a new Silk Road. Beijing's response has been subtle but profound, offering Tehran an economic lifeline that blunts the impact of Western sanctions and providing the diplomatic cover that prevents total international isolation. This is the nightmare scenario that keeps strategic planners in Washington awake at night, the three-front war. If the spark in the Middle East leads to a full-scale conflagration, the United States faces a terrifying mathematical reality. It would be forced to commit its dwindling resources to the Levant, while simultaneously holding the line against Russia in Europe and deterring a Chinese move on Taiwan in the Pacific. The dragon and the bear have realized that by supporting Iran, they can force the United States to overextend its reach, bleeding its treasury and exhausting its military until the American century finally snaps under the weight of its own commitments. The alliance between the dragon, the bear, and the Lion of Tehran is not yet a formal pact, but it is functional. They are bound by a mutual understanding that if one falls, the others are next. This is no longer a localized conflict over regional influence. It is a global chess match where Iran is a crucial piece on a board that spans half the globe. The red line drawn by American strikes has forced a choice not just in Tehran, but in Moscow and Beijing. As these three powers draw closer together, the risk is no longer just a regional war, but a global explosion, triggered by the interconnected interests of a new, defiant axis. The world now stands at a threshold where the margin for error has vanished. This is the final countdown, a period of history where every diplomatic cable, every troop movement, and every televised address carries the weight of 1,000 years. We find ourselves in a paradoxical reality where the weapons designed to prevent war are the very things that might ensure its arrival. The central question that haunts the modern era is whether the direct strikes we have witnessed are a successful restoration of deterrence or the opening notes of a global disaster. Deterrence is a fragile psychological state. It requires your enemy to believe that the cost of acting is higher than the benefit of the action. But when the strikes become direct, when the targets are high value and the blood is fresh, the line between deterrence and provocation becomes invisible. In the command centers of Washington and the underground bunkers of Tehran, the logic of the Cold War has returned with a digital vengeance. But unlike the standoff between the Soviets and the Americans, the current crisis moves at the speed of a fiber optic cable. We are no longer in a world of red telephones and weeks of deliberation. We are in the age of the algorithm, where autonomous drones and hypersonic missiles can escalate a skirmish into a regional firestorm before a diplomat can even draft a statement. The doomsday clock, that symbolic measure of our proximity to global catastrophe, has never ticked closer to midnight. The scientists and strategists who maintain it warn that the combination of nuclear proliferation, regional instability, and the breakdown of international treaties has created an environment more volatile than the Cuban Missile Crisis. The final countdown is also a battle of domestic survival. In the United States, the political pressure to appear strong in the face of Iranian aggression is balanced against a deep, weary public desire to avoid another endless war in the Middle East.
In Iran, the regime faces the ultimate dilemma: to strike back hard enough to satisfy its hardline base and maintain its regional prestige, or to show restraint to avoid a total war that could lead to its own destruction. Both sides are walking a tightrope over an abyss, and the wind is picking up. We are seeing the limits of maximum pressure and strategic patience meeting at a single explosive point in time. If we look for exit ramps, they are difficult to find. Trust is the first casualty of a missile strike. The international institutions designed to mediate such conflicts, from the United Nations to The Hague, find themselves sidelined by the raw power of the new Axis and the resurgence of great power competition. We are witnessing a new kind of conflict, a hybrid war where cyber attacks on power grids and water systems precede the fall of bombs. It is a war that would not stay in the Middle East. It would be felt in the gas prices at a pump in Ohio, in the flickering of a computer screen in London, and in the empty shelves of a market in Shanghai. As we reach the end of this narrative, we're forced to confront a chilling truth. World War III is not a destination we reach, it is a direction we travel. It is a series of small, incremental choices by leaders who believe they can control the fire they have started. The lesson of history is that fire is never easily controlled. The final countdown is not just about missiles and maps, it is about the human capacity to stop the clock before the last second ticks away. We are closer to the edge than we have been in generations, and the path back to the shadows is narrowing with every passing hour. The question remains, will we find the courage to de-escalate, or will the final countdown end in the deafening silence of a world transformed by the reality of fire?